Good morning. In this session, we're going to look at how to build an .NET MVC plus AngularJS web application very quickly and easily. So what we're going to focus on is building a very easy and simple web app based on AngularJS. Then take this web app and build it into Linux.net, well, embed it into Linux.net as a component. So hence the title, quick and easy way to write little web apps. So first of all, what our end goal is, what we're trying to do, we're trying to create a very basic self-contained web app. So it's not going to be very scalable. So all we care about is creating this app and maintaining it in the easiest way possible. And obviously we're going to take this application that we've built and embed it into Linux.net as an external component. Therefore, it has to be a self-contained application. So the scope of this project would be, we're going to build the whole application in HTML5 as a single page application driven by AngularJS on the client side. We're going to use .NET MVC 5 for the backend, for the web API, and just generally generate the actual page. So this is going to be our project based on MVC 5. We're going to attach a beautiful and fluid UI interface using just a standard UI Bootstrap. And we're going to consume Linux.net API to get the data out of Linux.net system and then push the data back in if we need to. So there's going to be 3 sessions, so we're going to cover all of those things in those 3 sessions. So hopefully by the end of 3 hours, we're going to have a fully working web application that we can put inside Linux.net. So the first session, we're going to focus on the front end. So creating an MVC.net project or .NET MVC project, putting an AngularJS engine inside it, creating routing and in AngularJS, creating binding and attaching UI components and using UI Bootstrap as well to get us some nicely looking directives for the user interface side of things. Session number 2, we're going to look at how to build a backend. So we're going to create a web API based on MVC, and then we're going to consume that web API service from AngularJS application, which is our client side. In this session number 3, we're going to look at authorization, how we can get AngularJS, our app, to keep the Linux.net authorization token, and how to push that token onto Linux.net web services, and how we can create an application in Linux.net extension, publish it, and then can basically build it into a Linux.net system. So final product, what I'm trying to achieve is something like this. So I'm going to create a low stock dashboard that effectively sits within Linux.net. It's going to sit there as a component, and when a user clicks on it, they will see a dashboard that I've created myself, where they will be able to choose a location, and then based on that location, it'll show them what's the stock levels, those stock levels, and we're going to page that result so we don't see all of the stock levels in one screen, all stock items in one screen, and the user will be able to then click on a product and see some sort of chart. So the way we're going to do this is, as already mentioned, we're going to use MVC.net purely so that we can contain both client-side application, which is based on our AngularJS, with the routing actually handled by AngularJS, and web API, so we can contain the whole thing in one project, which is going to use .NET MVC. Also gives us an ability to generate the views, which is our HTML, from MVC using some server-side generated code. Well, so the actual client will be interfacing with an application purely written in HTML5 that purely sits on the client side, and it's on AngularJS. AngularJS in turn talks to the web API written in .NET MVC to get all the data, to handle things like authorization and communication with Linux.net And obviously Web API in its own right will be talking to Linux.net to get all the data out of the system. Alright, let's get started. And the first thing we need to do is we need to create a project. Alright, so I'm just going to jump into Visual Studio. And we're going to create a clean project with nothing in it. So things to configure when you're creating your ASP.NET MVC application is you need to turn off application inside. And quite frankly, I recommend turning off anything that Visual Studio is trying to put in your project to keep it clean, and to keep it to keep it as clean as possible. All right, so I'm going to call my project Low Stock Dashboard. And then the next level, basically from the templates, let's not actually going to template our project at all. We're just going to select an empty web project. Add references to MVC and a web API, so we have everything in our project set up to handle both. And that's about it. Okay, so we've got our MVC project, and the first thing I need to do is I need to create a controller and a view for that controller that the system will execute, well, our website will execute when we actually go into a default directory. So if we go into app start and look at the routing config, so this is what MVC is using to kind of direct the execution to the right controller, and based on that controller, what action do we have based on the URL that you specified in your browser. And what we can see is there is a default routing specified at the moment, and by default it will route us to a controller called home, and the action will be index. So let's do exactly that. We're going to add a new controller, just an empty controller. We'll call it home, and there is an action called index. Right click on that and add view. Right, let's not make it a partial view or a view that uses a layout, just an empty templated view that effectively just add a little bit of HTML code in there. And I'm going to delete the layout as well, and just so that we can see the result of our hard work, I'm going to put the famous hello world in there. Alright, let's just execute to see that it's actually working. Okay, so by default the website is configured to go into home index, and that's basically tells the MVC to go execute a home controller and then call a method in the index, and that will basically get us the index view, which we specify to just say hello world. So effectively that's an MVC routing if you think about that. But again, as I already mentioned, we're not actually using MVC for its intended purpose. We're just using it to contain our AngularJS project. And obviously we will use MVC, going forward once we actually start working with the web API, because MVC allows us to create a web API. So that's the code behind the business end of the application very easily. Alright, so as I mentioned before, what we're trying to do is a beautiful looking application. So as you can see, my application doesn't look beautiful at all. It's just some straightforward flat HTML. The easiest way to get your application to look very nice is to use something like Bootstrap. And also for the Angular part, we can also use some of the AngularJS UI components. So again, if you remember how my application looked in the mock-up, you've seen that it had a panel at the top that looks pretty, quite pretty. So this is the things that Bootstrap allows us to implement in the system very quickly. So what we can do is we can go online basically and Google get Bootstrap. And this is the Bootstrap components that very easily can be embedded in your application, well, can be added to your application. And in Get Started, you can see how you can just attach those 4 scripts to your index.html page, and you'll get the Bootstrap code with all the nicely looking layouts and things like that. Also, we're going to use AngularJS Angular UI Bootstrap that contains sounded directives, and I'm going to use specifically this pager directive to give us a very simple way to handle the paging in the grid. So I'm going to have a table, and that table, whenever I switch the page, that table will refresh based on the page that I've selected. So those are the 2 components that I need. So again, in a getting started, we can just see how we can go and attach all the things that we need. So instead of referencing those files, I actually prepared CSS. So I've downloaded all those components and put them in a CSS folder and in a script folder. So to make my life easier, I'm just going to go and copy this CSS and scripts and stick it in my solution. I'm also going to just click this button. I call this button called Don't Lie to Me, so show me all the files, and then going to select my CSS and scripts, and we'll just add them, include them into the project, so I have them right there and then. Okay, so let's start with actually modifying index.html page. So this is the thing that gets shown to us when we actually went on our web page. And this is where we're going to put our AngularJS program basically in. And this is where we're going to put our AngularJS application actually in. So index.html will initialize AngularJS, and all the routing, all of the client-side, client-facing stuff will be happening, will be contained in this index.html. So I actually have some code that I've written before. I'm just going to open up this code, and I'm going to copy the first part. So this is I'm going to walk you through what it all means as well. So first of all, it's an HTML page. We've got a title, and the first thing that we need to do to enable AngularJS on our web page is to actually reference that. The easiest thing to reference that, the easiest way to reference it, is by just basically inserting all of those Google APIs references to the JavaScript component, JavaScript files themselves. Also, as you can see, I've got a reference to Spa app.js. So this is my AngularJS JavaScript effectively. So we actually referenced AngularJS, we referenced Angular routing and jQuery just for the sake of it, and now we need to go and actually write the AngularJS application, well, the actual model itself, module. So I'm going to structure my AngularJS application within my MVC by creating a folder. You create a folder in this thing, new folder. I'm going to call it Spa for single page application, because that's exactly what it is. It's going to be a single page based within HTML or index.html, and it will actually handle all of the client-facing stuff within that single page. And since MVC itself, or AngularJS, is very close to MVC design pattern, some people refer to it as MVVM, which is model view model, but in fact it is just MVC, so it has got a controller, a view, and a model effectively. So because it's MVC, effectively let's structure it pretty much exactly the same way. We're going to have a controller, and we're going to have some views. and we're actually going to have the application. So I'm going to add a JavaScript and call it an app. And let's copy some text for, well, some code for the app.js. And it's pretty much just a declaration that app will be an AngularJS model. I will give it a name, and we're going to inject some directive into it, or some set of directives into our model. So in our case, it's going to be ng routing, and we're going to come to that a little later as well. And into the application, we need to insert a main controller as well. So if we jump back to our index.html, you can see that I've defined a div on my page that will be an AngularJS app, and it will have a controller called main controller. So when application instantiates, it declares all the controllers in its space, effectively. And obviously, when you write a more scalable application, you would make it so that those controllers get loaded in the runtime. The same as Linux.net is actually based on AngularJS framework. It's well, it's not based on AngularJS framework. It is Linux.net is written based on a single application AngularJS design pattern, I suppose. But the framework was designed for Linux.net, and the way it works is basically loads all the modules separately as and when you need them. That makes the whole system scalable. What we are making is not very scalable because we're literally just going to preload all the controllers when the application starts. As you can see, I've got main controller here, and the first thing I need to do is actually go and add that main controller. No, that's not going to be MVC controller, it's going to be just JavaScript. Add JavaScript file and call it main controller. Let's copy some paste for some code for the main controller. Okay, that's just going to be pretty much just a empty function. So main controller is a function that takes scope, and you can go and read a little bit about what scope is and how AngularJS actually works, but that's just a little bit of outside of our of the scope we're trying to do. But effectively, scope is something that glues all of your AngularJS application, all of the AngularJS controllers. It glues them all together. So effectively, this is where it's your scope, or it's your application base, if you think about it. And so we're just going to declare a function that will become our controller, and we're going to inject the scope into that function. And from the app itself, we're going to declare the fact that it is a controller of our application. One other thing that we need to do, let's jump into our index.html again, and we are loading app.js. Obviously, when we load the app.js, it will try to add a main controller into the application space. But because we haven't actually we haven't declared the script to be loaded by the web browser, when we start the application, it will be able to find that code. It will be able to find this controller. So what we need to do is we need to actually declare, we need to tell the browser to load all of those scripts that we've written, all of those controllers, before the app.js. So all of those controllers have to be loaded before you actually initialize the app.js. So the app.js is pretty much going to be the last component on our referenced JavaScripts. Okay, so we can go and run this at the moment. And what I want to introduce straight away is AngularJS binding through the scope. As you can see, in my AngularJS application, I've got a controller, main controller, and it's got those curly brackets and my variable. This is the way we do binding in AngularJS. So what it's going to do is going to go to our main controller, into the scope, and we'll render this my variable with what actually declared in the scope as my variable. So what I can do here is I can actually go and type something like scope, so I don't misspell, I'm just going to copy and paste this. my variable, and I'm going to say something like hello there. So what's going to happen now is when we actually load index.html, it will load up AngularJS code. It will load our main controller where we're going to declare in the scope my variable hello there, and instantiate the AngularJS application. And then basically, because we declared this div to use main controller, it will actually drive us into that scope, and we'll be able to render this my variable on the page. Okay, let's execute it and see what it looks like. Okay, so we've got our index.html, and as you can see, I've got my variable rendered in the browser there. It's all looking great. Okay, so let's make our application beautiful. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to attach all the Bootstrap CSS, all the Bootstrap JavaScript files. I've got the Bootstrap Angular UI Bootstrap as well to attach. So all of those JavaScripts that I've added there, and all of those CSS files that I've added in there. So I'm going to go ahead and just basically plug them into my referencing, just like that. And now I can go and actually design my application to look beautiful. So I'm just going to go and copy some code and stick it instead of this my variable. So that's going to be the top navigation bar. Let's see what it looks like now. Okay, so I've got that bar at the top, I've got search box, and I've got the drop down box as well. As you can see, this drop down box is a list of locations. I just hard coded them in for the time being, because we're going to look at how we can get the data from the web API, so from the server or from your database or from another service, beyond your AngularJS application. We're going to look at that in the next session, but for the time being, we're just going to pretty much hard code everything that we do. So this is the list of all my locations, and as you can see, what I've done is I literally hard coded them in as just a label and a list of things within that label. And because I'm using Bootstrap, I could just wrap them around into a drop down box. So the next thing what I want to do is I want to show you how you can bind like say a drop down box to an AngularJS model effectively. So this is in the scope. I'm going to declare a list of those warehouse locations, and then I'm going to bind my user interface to that list. So let's just copy some code again. I'm going to walk you through that code as well. Okay, so in the scope, I'm going to declare a model, and within that model, I'm going to have a variable, basically, or a property called locations, and that locations property will have a list of things, basically. That list will contain an object, effectively, with a property ID and a location. That's all it does. We're also going to declare another property called locations, selected location, and that will just take the first element, the first item in that list by default. We're going to create a function within the scope dot, then the name of the function, then declare it as a function that will take a location that we've selected in drop down box. And taking that location, we're going to change the selected location to the selected location, effectively. We're just going to see how easy it is to bind things in on the user interface to our code behind, which is our JavaScript, effectively contained within a controller. So let's return to our index.html. I'll replace this bit. And what this is actually doing is we've got the same label as we had before, but instead of actually hard-coded application name, we're actually binding this to the scope selected location dot location. Okay, so let's come back to our controller and see exactly what it binds to. It binds to a scope. We don't actually say it binds to a scope, we just say the actual property name within that scope. Then selected location would be an object, one of those that's got an ID property and a location property, and we just say exactly like this, dot location. So it effectively will take a location, one of those, out of this object. Next, we have a list, and then the element within the list, we use it as ngRepeat. ngRepeat is a very useful AngularJS function. It's pretty much well the AngularJS directive that basically iterates through a list and just duplicates the same element multiple times. And in ngRepeat, we've got a definition of that repeat as take it from the model locations list and put them in X every time we iterate through that list, and output this X into a label. So X.location will be outputted into that list. And every time we select that element, it will call a function within our controller called changeLocation, and will provide X into that function. If we go into main controller, we can see that changeLocation is a function that takes a location. And every time we select something out of a list, it will literally just put that object into this function, and we will be able to assign selected location to that selected object. Okay, so since we've just done some changes to the JavaScript, we don't need to recompile and rebuild the whole code. Actually, I do need to restart it because I closed the browser. Okay, so as you can see, now our list is not just hard-coded, it's actually taking the data out of our controller. If we click on that, we can see that it's got all of those locations that we hard-coded in our controller. So it bound this list to what we have declared in controller. And if I select something, it actually changes it at the top as well. Okay, so let's implement some routing in our AngularJS application. So basically, routing, what it is in MVC is when we type something in here, let's say home, and then some action, it will actually route it on an MVC level. It will route it to a controller called home, and it will execute an action called action, basically. We can do the similar thing in AngularJS, but all the routing happens on the client side. It never goes to the server. And also we can, within the controller, we can have views. So effectively in the routing, we can declare what view will be rendered in that sort of execution scope. So what we have is effectively this top bar at the top that will remain static all the time. And then underneath that bar, we're going to have a view that will, in there, basically that will render our HTML based on where we actually going, or based on the routing, for example. Okay, so I think I can just close this and stop the application execution. And let's do the following. Let's actually change our app.js to be like follows. So effectively the same thing, it's an app, it's an AngularJS module, but there we're going to declare a function, config function, and we're going to inject some routing information from AngularJS application HTTP provider into it. So this is what actually gets us to be able to handle routing in AngularJS application. And effectively it tells us that when we're rendering, well, AngularJS will be able to handle all the browser URL changes, and every time the URL changes, well, within the scope of the page, so it's after the hashtag, it basically will evaluate where we need to go, what we need to do actually, or what controller and what view we need to load. So every time we see /grid, this is the view that we're going to load. So we're going to load another HTML. We'll be able to attach a grid controller to it, which we haven't actually written yet, but we will in a second, and we'll be able to render it within the HTML page. Okay, in any other scenario, we're going to return that we're going to basically redirect to a /grid. So grid effectively will become our home page, a default page that gets opened up. So no matter what I type in there, / something else, it will always divert us to the grid. Okay, so since what we need is a grid controller and a grid HTML view, so let's go and write them. Again, let's add a JavaScript controller. I'm going to call it grid controller. We're going to add a view called grid. Let's put some dummy text for the time being in there. And okay, I think that's about it. And obviously, because we added a new controller, let's actually put some code in there. That'll be very useful. Just declare it as a AngularJS controller. So grid controller is just a function that takes scope. That's enough for the time being. And obviously we've added a new script. We need to tell our page, single application page, that we've added a new one. So let's actually declare it and say grid controller. Okay, and now we need to add a view to the index.html. So effectively we have a controller, and it will be able to handle routines now, since we added that into the app.js, but we haven't got anywhere to actually render that HTML that we've taken from the grid HTML page every time we root somewhere. Okay, so we need to actually define in our within this scope, within the AngularJS controller, where is it going to actually render our views. And we do that by just sticking this thing in. It's a div called ngView, and then this is where we're going to render all the views. Alright, let's execute this and see if it actually works. Might have missed something. Okay, it does work. As you can see, when I root into to /grid, it renders our view called some grid that just contains a text. So basically, if I go into this grid HTML and I put something else in there, and refresh this page now, you can see it renders that from this view. So what I want to see in that grid view is actually a grid. So our grid is going to be just a simple table listing some products and their stock levels. Let's refresh that, and that's what we're going to get. So we're going to get a table that lists all the products. Obviously, at the moment, for the time being, I've just hard-coded all the products in there. But what I'm going to do is I want to bind this table to a list of products that I'm going to get from a grid controller. So going forward within the grid controller, we actually going to send a command, well, going to execute a method in our web API. And that web API will talk to linworks.net, will get a list of all the low stock levels, return that as an object to web API. Web API will return it back to the AngularJS. And this is going to represent our list of low stock levels. But for the time being, I just want to hard code everything so that we can have the UI working, and then we can start adding code behind to that UI. And what we're going to do is just going to copy this text. Again, I'm just going to walk you through it. So in our grid controller, we're going to declare a data within the scope, a data model. Let's call it data model that contains another model called low stock data. So it's effectively an object that has got number of total items that we got from number of low stock level items, current page we're looking at, a number of items per page. So this is our page query. For example, we'll return the fact that there are a total of, let's say, 500,000 items, and you're looking at only 10 on page number 1. And then the data itself will actually have an object, well, list of objects that represent our stock level, well, product with a low stock level. Okay, and I'm just going to go and generate this data statically on the client side. So it's just a function called getData, and this function is going to push into low stock data, into data. It will push a new object every however many items per page we have. We're just going to iterate through them, just loop through them, and we're going to add those items into data. Okay, when we execute this controller, obviously this is just a declaration of the property within the model. This is just a declaration of a function, and obviously we need to actually call this function. So when this controller gets executed, I'm actually going to go and call this function, and it will add 10 products to our array. So that's going to do nothing because I haven't actually done the binding on the client side. Alright, so let's go to our grid HTML. What I'm going to do is I'm going to replace this T body for each row. Guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to use ng repeat to iterate through low stock data. X is going to be each element within that array, and for X we're going to output x.skew in one cell, and so on. So now we've got that binding. Ta-da! We've got the list. Okay, so we've got that list, and at the bottom of this list we want to have a paging controller. So we can draw that paging controller, and every time we change a page, the page changes, it gets the new data from the web server. So that could be your database, or in our case it's Linux.net API, where we're going to get the low stock level data. Now, using Bootstrap, AngularJS UI Bootstrap is very easy to add that sort of components, like I don't know, some kind of panels that do something, buttons, and paging controllers and grids and things like that. So I've already attached AngularJS UI. Well, I referenced it in the index.html as a JavaScript. So all I need to do is just to place this thing, which is a UI paging, a UIB paging directive, and specify some properties of that directive. So where we're going to get the total number of items. Bind it to our model. ng model within this component is actually binds to a currently selected page. So every time we change the page, this variable, this property of this model, of this object basically, will be changed. And every time we change a page, this function will be called page change. Okay, so now if we refresh this now, you'll see that nothing actually happened, right? So this, even after we added this directive in there, and we have actually referenced. Let's see, we actually have referenced the script UI Bootstrap TPLT blah blah blah, the current version. We have referenced it. It's a script that loaded into the application, but it didn't actually render anything, and that's because we haven't actually injected that list of directives into our AngularJS application. So what I need to do is I need to actually inject something. Yes, I need to inject this thing, UI Bootstrap, into AngularJS. There you go. And of course, if you go to AngularJS Bootstrap webpage, you'll be able to see how to get started, and it will tell you to do that straight away, so you're not going to miss it. But since we're building one thing on top of the other, I thought it's important I mentioned this thing. Okay, so let's refresh this now, and as you can see, I now have the paging. So if I change the page, nothing happens. As you can see, my grid doesn't change, and that's because I haven't implemented change page function in my controller. So I'm going to go into grid controller, scope, change page. It's going to be a function, and this function will take no parameters. We don't care about any parameters. And all we're going to do within this function, we're just going to call get data. Okay, so now every time we change the page, you can see it gets the new data. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I want to hook up to some events that happen outside of the single controller, single scope within a controller. Again, we are talking about what we're doing at the moment is pretty. It's a small web application, therefore it's not really scalable. That's why I can just afford to stick a global scope in the whole application, and it's very easy to work with it because I've got all of the things that happen within all the controllers, and I have access to them, so I can hook them up. So what I'm trying to do is whenever I change this location, so what happens at the moment, it just changes this attribute there, well, this label there. But what I want to do is whenever I change this location, this grid sets it to the page number 1, and also will send a different command to, well, send a different request to the web service to get a specific location. So effectively, what I'm trying to do is I want to hook up to the event of when this list value changes. I want to hook up to it and refresh the grid. Okay, so let's go to our grid controller. Yeah, grid controller. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to hook up to through scope. We've got this thing called watch, and it's going to watch a change in the selected location property in our scope. And every time this selected location changes, we will be able to fire up this function that will set our current page to 1 and will get some data, obviously. What I can do there as well, when I'm generating the statically generating items, or in fact, let's do it differently. Current location will be taken from the scope currently selected location. This is the location I've selected in that drop down box, and location name, for example. And then we can take this current location and we can basically add an item into our array with that selected location in. Obviously, we would take the ID of this selected location, send this ID to the web API so that we can get the relevant data for that location. Okay, so now in our grid we have a location that we have selected in there. And if we go and switch this to a specific page, and then we change the location, it switches the page back to 1, and it puts the selected location in our list of items. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I want to implement a modal window. When I click on this product title, for example, I want a new window to pop up, like a context window, that will show us some stats, some graph, for example, of our stock level changes, and that's the application I'm designing, basically. Again, what I can do is I can use a AngularJS UI, Bootstrap, to generate a new modal window. And again, if you go to AngularJS directives, we've got modal here, and effectively something like that. So we're going to open up a modal window, and it will have a chart in there, for example. I'm not going to have any buttons or anything like that. Okay, so the way we're going to do this, let's stop this solution execution because I'm going to need to add some files to it now. Is we need a controller for this modal window, and we need a view for this modal window. So that's what's going to go inside it. Okay, so I'm going to go and add a new controller. It's going to be a JavaScript. I think it's called view product controller. Yeah, view product controller, pink, and a view as well called similar to that, view product window. Ta-da. This is a window. Okay, so we need to add some code into view product controller, and I've got the code there. Okay, so we're just gonna go and copy this thing, and again I'm gonna walk you through what this means. As you can see, this controller no longer just takes a scope. What it also does is takes another thing called UIB model instance and some data. Okay, but again, I'll explain what it does a bit later on as well. We need to change our UI grid controller as well. In fact, let's do this thing first. Okay, so we now added our view product controller, and we added our view itself. And what we need to do is we need to go and declare this view product controller on our application. App controller, and then we add view product controller as a controller. And that's obviously that's not going to actually work because we haven't loaded this view product controller into our HTML yet. So let's go and ensure that it is loaded. View product controller, and also I'm going to go and reference some stuff. So this is for my lovely looking chart, and there's another thing called the Angular chart that allows you to bind a chart component, which is declared in there in chart.js. That's just a script that I actually found on the white spaces of internet that allows you to draw nicely looking charts in JavaScript. So then, in order to easily bind a AngularJS models to that chart, there's another kind of staging component in Angular chart, and also some CSS for those charts. That's all those things do. Okay, and where was I? Okay, the grid controller. I think that's about it. That's all we need for the time being. Okay, so now I should have, oh yes, there's one more thing. Obviously, because we added this chart controller, we need to actually inject the directive called charts into our application, chart.js. Okay, so we're just going to inject that. And now we have added a charting component. We have added a controller called View Product Controller that we can instantiate when we open that window. And for that window, we can also use this View Product window for the actual view that will appear in that modal window. Right, so let's go and start putting the code to open up the window itself. So first of all, we need to change the controller itself, controller declaration, so that it includes this UIB model. This is a directive that basically gets rendered, that gets instantiated by the AngularJS application, by the UI AngularJS UI Bootstrap. And what I need to do is I need to declare it and effectively inject it when I initialize this component. Now we can use this declaration to actually open up a window. And we're going to do this, just going to copy this text in, and effectively it's a function within a scope that will take a parameter called product. This is the selected product that we had, and it will declare a new variable or a new model, model instance. I use this new thing that we injected into the controller to open a window. I'm going to specify that this is going to use this view with this controller, and it's going to pass in the data. So this is the third parameter we had in the view controller, this one. Into this data, we're going to actually inject the selected product. And this thing, again, you can go to AngularJS Bootstrap and see exactly how to use those modal windows. There's lots of things you can actually do, but effectively once we close this window, we're going to return some values out of it. Okay, and in the grid controller itself, you can see that I've got this link on the product title, and whenever I click this link, it will call ng function method, basically open product, and it will supply the current row's product object as a parameter into this function. Okay, so let's go and see if it actually going to work now. Visual Studio does that. When you add a new file, it thinks that this is the starting page for your project now, which is not very useful. Okay, so if we click that, you can see it actually opened up a new view with a new view product controller, and there's going to be some text in there. So let's make it look nicer. Actually, I'm going to put a grid into it, well, a chart into it. Okay, so in our view product controller, I'm going to declare some data. Okay, so just some labels and some series. This is for a chart, so we have some data to display it in the chart, and a selected product is going to be taken from our data. And what else? We need to actually add a chart. To view product window. There you go. Okay, so in our view product window, we're going to render selected product SKU and selected product title, and then basically draw a chart like that. I'm not going to go through exactly all the properties of this chart, but effectively it will draw a chart, hopefully. Okay, let's click on that page. Ta-da! Product and nicely looking chart. That's it. So next week we're going to look at how we can, now that we've hard coded, we've got the user interface, we've got some stuff working there, and now what we need to do is we actually need to create a web API. So this is the stuff that will sit on the server, and whenever we execute any function, any method to actually get some data, we're going to talk to the web API to get this data. So in the web API, this is where you can write your C# code to get the data from the SQL server or from the other web services, etc.